Hello there and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I'm going to be revisiting the laptop that started this whole channel a little over a year ago. Back then, I installed a new SSD, and today I want to show you how to clean and repaste this laptop, which is a process that should be done relatively often, especially if you use your laptop quite heavily. Repasting a laptop can help with temperatures and even longevity, because as a laptop is used over a long period of time, the thermal paste between its chips and heatsink can dry out. This causes the chips to run hotter, which is less ideal for their performance and lifespans. This video is obviously going to be an exact tutorial for this specific laptop model, which is the Lenovo Legion 15ARH05. However, I also want it to be a good overall guide for the general steps to cleaning and repasting a laptop. Hopefully, even if you have a laptop that's different than this one, this video will still be able to give you an idea of what the repaste and cleaning process should look like, and when paired with a teardown guide of your particular laptop, can hopefully help you perform this job. And with all of that out of the way, let's begin cleaning and repasting this laptop. In terms of tools that will be required for this job, the most important ones are a screwdriver and a pry tool. Generally, a simple metal spudger is the most effective tool to get inside a laptop. However, it is more likely to minorly scuff the laptop's chassis than a plastic one. So if you really don't want to risk marring up the case even slightly, I definitely recommend using a plastic tool rather than a metal one. Next, some tissues for wiping off the thermal paste will be helpful, and pairing those tissues with some isopropyl alcohol can aid in dissolving some really caked on thermal paste. Of course, new thermal paste will also be required. For cleaning the laptop's heat sinks and fans, either some canned air, an electric duster, or an air compressor will work fine. One last thing that might be beneficial to this job is some kind of screw organization tray, such as this magnetic whiteboard that I've got here. This isn't technically necessary, but it can be very helpful when dealing with laptops that use different screws for everything, just so that you don't mix them up. Now to begin the disassembly, place your already shut down laptop upside down so that the screws on the bottom case can be removed. And on this specific laptop, do note that the 4 screws that run along the front of the laptop are shorter than the other screws, which are used in the middle of the panel and near the rear I/O. So keep track of the screws that you're removing in order to not mix them up. Once the screws are removed, a pry tool can be inserted into the seam along the bottom and top panels to pop the panel clips. I find that starting in one of the front corners of the laptop works really well to get started. These clips can be stubborn at times, so don't be afraid to put a bit of force into your prying. Just be wary that you don't shove the pry tool into the laptop too far, or you could puncture the battery or something. One more thing on removing the bottom panel of this laptop that might be helpful if it's your first time. The seam between the 2 panels goes up and along this vent, so inserting your pry tool like I do here on screen helps get the panel off. With the back cover removed from the laptop, we're granted access to the heatsink and fans, which are our targets for today. Also, if you're following along with a different laptop, find out how to remove the bottom cover for your laptop, or maybe even the keyboard, because some laptops also open like that, and you'll be up to speed with where I'm at. With the laptop open, the first thing that we need to do is to disconnect the battery. Though the laptop is shut down, several parts of the motherboard are still energized, and accidents such as dropping screws and slipping with a screwdriver happen to everyone. If something like that happens while the motherboard is energized, and you end up shorting the wrong contacts, it can be a death sentence for your laptop. It's such cheap insurance. Just disconnect the battery, which on this laptop can be done by grabbing the sides of this connector and pulling it straight back towards the battery. One thing that I love about this Legion laptop is that it's constructed in a way that we can do our repaste job without having to remove the motherboard to get to the cooler assembly screws. Some laptops will have their coolers mounted on the other side of their motherboard, in which case you'll have to remove the motherboard first before removing the cooler. So if you're following along on a different laptop, be on the lookout for that. Since we don't have to do that with this machine though, we can jump right into the cooling system disassembly. I like to start by unplugging the 2 fans from the motherboard first so that I don't forget and try to take the fans out later and yank on the cables. One fan's connector can be removed simply by pulling directly up, and the other can be taken out by pulling it towards the back of the laptop. Due to the construction of this laptop, The next step now that the fans are unplugged is actually not going to be to remove them. This is because a part of the fans goes underneath a heat pipe from the cooler, so we're going to remove that first. When removing the cooler, you need to be careful with how you unscrew it. Pretty much every single laptop cooler I've seen is what's known as a direct die cooler, meaning that the heatsink touches the silicon of the chips directly. Because of this, it's important to make sure that we loosen and tighten the cooler evenly in all directions, as to not put too much pressure on a quarter of one of the dies, which technically has the potential to crack it and kill the chip. This is doable by moving in an X pattern while moving each screw by 1 or 2 turns. Do 1 round on the CPU, switch to the GPU if you have one, then keep switching back and forth each round of X pattern screwing to remove the heatsink without risking damage to the chips. Or, if your laptop is like this Legion one, you can just follow the numbers that are conveniently put next to each screw in order. Go through screws 1 through 6, moving each screw by about 2 turns, and keep cycling back and going through all the screws until fully loosened in order to take off the heatsink. With the heatsink unscrewed, ensure that this little piece of copper tape is unstuck from the heatsink, and then grab the heatsink around the edges of its cold plates to lift it off. There might be some resistance to pulling it straight up if your thermal paste is old, and the thermal pads that contact the power delivery circuitry, as well as the GPU's VRAM, will stick it down a bit, but it shouldn't be exceptionally stuck on. And this is actually one of the reasons that I say to lift up from the edges of the cold plates of the heatsink, rather than the actual heatsink fins on the far sides of the construction. Most of the resistance will be at the cold plates, so lifting from there will both give you the most control and avoid the risk of bending the heat pipes, which could happen when lifting the assembly off by the heatsink fins. Setting the rest of the laptop aside now that the cooler's off, let's take a look at the heatsink assembly that we've all hopefully got removed from the laptop at this point. This assembly, although mostly made of metal, is quite fragile, so do be careful with it. Specifically, handle it in a way that you won't risk bending one of the heat pipes, as that can kink them and ruin their ability to transfer heat properly. Plus, these assemblies can be annoyingly expensive to replace depending on the laptop. My heatsink is surprisingly clean, considering how much I've used my laptop since the last time I cleaned it, that being well over a year ago. There's a little bit of a dust bunny that I'll wipe off, but beyond that, I won't actually be doing too much with this heatsink today. Wiping off the large conglomerates of dust and other stuff is really the best way to take care of that kind of dirt, but what about the dust that's inside the heatsink fins that we can't wipe out easily? Now, to take care of this dust, I recommend using either one of those disposable cans of quote-unquote compressed air, it's not really air, or one of those electric air blower things. These usually run about $30 online and are more than worthwhile investment if you're going to be cleaning computers semi-regularly. If neither of these options work for you, you can also definitely use a regular air compressor on the heatsink assembly and the fans, though I'd recommend limiting its output pressure so that you don't blow the fins on the fans too hard. I might also caution against using this method on parts of the computer such as the motherboard due to concerns about condensation and static electricity. There are so many arguments about this online though, so I really can't say anything for certain other than that if you want to play it safe, stick to one of the aforementioned methods that's not the air compressor. One last thing before we wipe off the thermal paste. When blowing air through the heatsink fins, make sure to blow the air into the side of the heatsink that is regularly its exhaust, so that you blow the dust out of the heatsink rather than just pushing it further in. Now let's clean up the thermal paste on the heatsink. This process, like the process of cleaning dust out of the heatsink, is practically identical across most laptops and even desktops. There are products and methods out there that people have tested for the best way to remove thermal paste, but honestly, as long as you get 95% of it off, you'll be fine. To get 95% of it off, you need this really advanced tool that costs a lot of money. Well, actually no. You need a paper towel or a tissue or even some toilet paper if you're running low on the other two options. Simply wipe off the thermal paste and that's it. If your thermal paste is really old and cooked on there, you're probably going to need to use your fingernail or a small scraper behind the paper towel to pick off that dried paste. Now, although I just said that you really only need some paper product to remove the old thermal paste, I would actually recommend adding one other thing, that being a little bit of isopropyl alcohol. It just helps get a little more of the old paste off the heatsink and can also help loosen up dried paste. I use 99% isopropyl, but really any concentration will work as long as it's fully dry when you reassemble the laptop, which can take a little longer with something like 70% isopropyl. Once your heatsink is nice and clean, like mine is here, set it aside in a safe place so that we can work on the fans before we clean the chips and reassemble the machine. Back to some instructions that are specific to this laptop, as your machine might have had the fans already removed, or maybe they came out with the heatsink. We're going to unscrew the fans now from the laptop body so that we can clean them out. Somewhat frustratingly, the fans in this laptop use two different kinds of screws, a single, longer silver screw that's located closer to the laptop's hinge, and two shorter black screws that are closer to the motherboard. Both fans use the same combination of screws, so just remember to put the silver screws near the hinges on both fans and to keep the black screws closer to the motherboard. There is a small quirk relating to the right side fan, so I'm going to start with the left side fan first. After removing the screws for this fan, since we've already unplugged it earlier, lift it out and set it aside. Then, onto the right side fan, the screw configuration is similar, except for the fact that one of the shorter black screws is shared between the fan and the heat shield for the SSD and Wi-Fi card. To get the fan out, remove all the screws, and I've found that you can pretty easily remove the fan by lifting the cooler to just flex the thin metal piece out of the way, and then slide the fan towards the back of the laptop to get it out. My fans look perfectly clean, but you can clean yours out by blowing air into the sides of the fans where the air is blown out to get the dust out of them. Try not to let them spin too much when blowing air on them, but also make sure to get the air on all of the blades of the fans. Also, one final note before I move on, both of these fans are slightly different, so don't be concerned with mixing up which one came from the left side of the laptop and which one came from the right side. With the fans clean, it's time to clean the chips on the motherboard. This Lenovo Legion laptop has a CPU and a separate GPU, so with my particular machine, you'll need to clean two chips, but your laptop may only have one. Also, we're only cleaning the chips that have the old thermal paste on them, so don't be concerned about any of the other chips on the motherboard. To clean these chips, I like to use a tissue and gently wipe off the majority of the paste from the chip with it. After most of the paste is gone, I put some alcohol on the tissue and go back over the chip once or twice. If your paste is really hard, you can dribble some alcohol onto the chip directly and let it soak for a while to hopefully soften up the paste. The only thing to worry about when cleaning these chips is getting the surface of the die clean. If you put a bit too much thermal paste on your chips like me, or a lot of laptop manufacturers, it can spill off the sides and look kind of messy, but as long as it's like most modern pastes today, meaning it's non-conductive, this shouldn't negatively impact your laptop, and you also don't need to clean it off to repaste your machine. Plus, with these direct die coolers, having a bit of extra paste but having the whole area of the die covered is significantly better than having a spot on the die without any paste on it. Cleaning these chips is pretty much identical to cleaning the heatsink, though you do need to be a little more careful around the dies, not because the dies themselves are super fragile, but because there are oftentimes small capacitors around the dies that can easily be knocked off by your finger and tissue, and that would be a very bad thing. Here I've taken a macro shot of the capacitors on this laptop's GPU compared to the tip of a common 0.7mm ballpoint pen. These things are tiny and easy to damage, so be careful with them. With the dies pretty shiny and clean, we can put the new paste on and begin the reassembly of the laptop. It's really important to have full coverage with the thermal paste on these dies, on these kinds of coolers, as a blank spot could cause a very high hotspot temperature. So, there are a few ways to put paste on that will ensure this full coverage, and I'll share two of them with you today. One method is to place a glob of paste in the middle of the die, and then to use a small plastic spudger to spread it across every square millimeter of the die like butter on toast. The other method is way lazier, and also my preferred method for my personal machine because it's easy. This method involves putting a glob of paste on the chip, like with the other method, but then I use the tip of the thermal paste tube to just spread the paste everywhere. This leads to a less even coverage of paste, and generally aids in putting more paste than necessary onto the chip, as I'll often end up squeezing some extra out from the tube when I'm working to cover the die, but it's pretty easy to get the whole chip covered, and you don't need anything other than your thermal paste tube. Next, all we're going to do is take the laptop apart in reverse order. And since I've talked a lot in this video already, while trying to give as much advice as I can, I'm going to end up doing this part in a bit of a lightning round as to respect your time. Remember, these instructions apply to this Legion 5 15ARH05 laptop, and if you're following along with a different laptop, consult a specific disassembly/reassembly guide for your specific machine. Since parts of the fans sit under the heatsink in this laptop, the first things I put back in are the fans. Each one only fits correctly on one side, so you can't mix them up. The left fan sits straight down, and to put the right one in, grab the SSD heat shield, bend it up slightly, and slide the fan's mount in underneath it. Put all the screws back in, with one long silver screw on each fan nearest to the hinges, and two of the shorter black screws in the mounting holes nearest to the motherboard. I recommend plugging the fans in now so that you don't risk forgetting. I don't know why I screwed my fans in after putting the heatsink back in this video, but what I've just said is probably the most logical order to follow. Put the heatsink back in by setting it straight down on top of the chips while holding it by the edges of the cold plate. Align the screw holes and start tightening using the same method used to loosen it, just tightening, of course. One small tip though, when putting the first turns on each screw, use some downward pressure on your screwdriver to ensure that each screw's threads bite the first time. Otherwise, one screw can end up not biting its threads, and your heatsink can end up very unevenly pressured by the time you realize one of your screws isn't actually screwing. And alright, I know I said this was going to be a lightning round, just going through the reassembly of the laptop real quickly, but here's actually a very serious interjection from script writing me. I'm only seeing this now as I'm scrubbing through my footage and scripting my voiceover based on it, but don't let this little piece of tape go under the heatsink like you see here. I can't believe I missed this. This is foil tape, and this has the capability of shorting out the motherboard. I've written this entire script on this laptop, and I filmed this at least 10 days ago, meaning I've used this laptop a lot since doing this. I think I've gotten extremely lucky in that this isn't causing my laptop any serious problems, and I'm going to fix this as soon as I'm able to, but don't let this happen because there's a chance you won't end up lucky like I somehow did. Okay, back to what I was doing before. After the fans are reinstalled, plugged back in, and the cooler is remounted, the battery connector can be reconnected to the motherboard. After that's done, the bottom cover can be replaced and snapped onto the laptop. I like to test my laptops before I screw on their bottom covers so that in case I missed something, I don't have to unscrew the bottom cover again. I quickly check that the laptop powers on properly, and then go and screw the cover on. And with that, the repaste job on this laptop is complete. If you're following along at home, run some benchmarks on your system and use a program such as HWInfo64 to make sure your temperatures are looking better than before. Well, that's all that I have for you today. I hope that you were able to at least enjoy this video and maybe even learn a thing or two. In any case, I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.